Jazzy, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone in the Pulitzer Center who's there tonight. I am so sorry that I cannot be there with you. I'm in Brussels right now. I leave in a few hours for Israel with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, but I am with you in spirit, and I'm always with what the Pulitzer Center does in spirit. I want to talk a little bit tonight about resilience and conflict reporting and my experience of how the two intertwine. And I want to start by telling a story. Of course, that's what we do, right? So I'll begin in October 2022 in a small city in eastern Ukraine called Balaklia. Ukrainian soldiers had just liberated the city's 25,000 residents from Russian occupation. And in the middle of town stood a Ukrainian police station that the Russians had used as one of their headquarters. We walked inside with Ukrainian police investigators, the equivalent of CSI, and walked into the heart of darkness. The Russians slept in the basement, which on the day we visited was lined with cots and discarded Russian cup of noodles. On the middle floor, Russians detained Ukrainian men in small cells for solitary confinement. Each was 5 feet wide by about 10 feet long. On one of the walls, a Ukrainian prisoner had scratched a line for each day he had spent in detention. There were more than 30 scratches. In another cell, the Ukrainian prisoner had scratched the Lord's Prayer, of course, including the line, "Deliver us from evil." Then we went upstairs. The Russians had commandeered the police commander's offices and turned those offices into torture chambers. The Russians had not cleaned up before they fled. They left behind the wire they used to strangle, the broken off baton they used to beat and sodomize, the electricity source they used to electrocute, the devices of dehumanization. The police then took us to a nearby graveyard. There were dozens of rows of smartly dug graves, each marked with a gravestone or placard depicting the names of the dead and the dates when they were born and when they died. But at the edge of the graveyard, the rows stopped, the gravestones stopped, and neatly dug graves had been replaced with mounds of dirt, sitting side by side. No markings, just an occasional cross above hastily created graves. And under one of the mounds lay a Ukrainian named Maxim Shalikin. A few months before, Russian occupiers had tortured him in that prison, murdered him, and gave his body to his brother to hastily bury. Gravediggers began digging, not a new grave. They began digging Maxim's grave. The police needed to exhume his body in order to find signs of torture, in order to hold Russia accountable for that torture. There were a few journalists there, including myself and my team, and police investigators. And among those watching was a woman, Svetlana, Maxim's mother. She watched the unwatchable. The son she had birthed pulled out of what was supposed to be his final resting place. Police prodded his partially decomposed body. It was awful. The scene, the horror on her face, the stench of exhumation that I can still smell right now. In its dehumanization of its perceived Ukrainian enemies, Russia had stolen the dignity from even the dead. I had to walk away. I sat behind a small shack and I cried. I had witnessed Svetlana watching Maxim's grave, but I had seen my wife over our infant son's grave and our newborn daughter's grave. I had seen my mother over my grave. I can still smell the body. I can still close my eyes and see Svetlana's face. I can still see so many scenes of trauma across half a dozen war zones or natural disasters, from Katrina to Ukraine to Gaza to Pakistan. I can still see so many scenes of loss. Svetlana's trauma is unspeakable. What of the trauma for those who tell her story? The journalist, the translator, the camera person who interrupts one of the single worst moments in her life and asks, "How are you doing? How are you feeling? Tell me about your son. Tell me about your son." The nature of that question, that request, I suppose, is the core of the challenge that confronts journalists who cover trauma. How do we ask that question without exploiting Svetlana? How do we best understand and communicate her story without making her experience the trauma once again? How do we stay resilient while exposing ourselves to this kind of pain? If we are to be resilient, as we share stories of horror, we must believe it is okay to make that request, to ask that question. We must believe that we are not exploiting Svetlana, but instead creating empathy in our audience for her and her family. We must believe by asking Svetlana about her son, he transforms from a statistic into a story, from a number into a person. We must believe that by sharing Svetlana's story, we are recapturing that which the Russians twice stole: her son's dignity, her son's humanity, her son's name. Tell me about your son. To do what we do and remain resilient, we must believe in the catharsis of storytelling, that our own empathy, which allows us to both to tell her story and makes us vulnerable, can also become our shield. The author Leslie Jamison wrote a book of essays called The Empathy Exams. She learned about empathy as a medical actor. She plays sick. Her role, her character, is a 23-year-old female patient who details her seizures to a psychiatry medical student. The patient that Jamison plays does not realize that her seizures began because her brother drowned. She thinks it's unrelated. The students examine Jamison's character, trying to understand the source of her seizures. And afterward, Jamison judges them and gives them report cards whether they, one, voiced empathy. That must be so hard. I can't imagine. And also, whether they unlock the source of her seizures. And to discover that, they must demonstrate an empathy that goes beyond the voicing of compassion, the exhibiting of compassion. They have to ask the right question. In other words, empathy isn't only about remembering to say, "That's so hard, I can't imagine how difficult." Empathy is figuring out how to shine a light on the trauma so it can be seen in the first place. Empathy is not just about listening, it is asking the questions that need to be listened to. Empathy comes from the Greek, em, into, pathos, feeling. As Jamison puts it, it's a kind of travel into a person's feelings, into a person's pain. Surely that is what we journalists must do to share someone's story. We don't ask the traumatized to relive their trauma. We've been trained not to do that. We invite them to share their trauma with us. We invite them to communicate their fears, their memories, their hopes, the awful moments that have brought us both to that moment that we ask that question. We invite them to tell us their story, to unveil the attributes that make them and us human, that give them dignity and give the victims dignity as well. Tell me about your son. We sit with our characters, we probe their memories and emotions, not to exploit, but to understand, to unlock that which it is vital to share. And to share their story, we must demonstrate a willingness to travel into their pain. We must not only voice empathy, but figure out which questions to ask. We must find the trauma so we can understand it and then hopefully communicate it in a way that is memorable and meaningful for our audience. And if we want our readers or viewers or listeners to give a shit, excuse my French, we better give a shit too. I have cried countless times during interviews. I believe, they're not crocodile tears. I cry because despite having covered multiple conflicts, I'm still shocked by what some armies or people are capable of unleashing onto other people, often their own. I cry because I still feel the pain of loss, even if I have the privilege to leave the country that is at war. My visit is temporary. Their loss is permanent. I cried a few months ago, again, north of Kharkiv in Ukraine, with a 65-year-old Ukrainian named Anatoly Chrapach. The area that we were visiting had recently been liberated by Ukrainian soldiers, and once again, the Russians left behind horror. A Russian tank had fired on a car carrying a family trying to escape north from Kharkiv city. That day, a few months before we got there, the Russians had killed a man named Andriy and his daughter, Ksenia, who was 9 years old. The burned out shell of the car had sat there for a few months on the side of the road until that day when we got there with Ukrainian police investigators. Chrapach was not one of those investigators. He was the father of Andriy, the man who was killed in the car while trying to flee Kharkiv. Tell me about your son. We had a good cry. I asked him, why are you here? Why have you chosen to expose yourself to the scene of the crime, the spot where your son had been murdered? He said something that I only now understand as a parent. How could I not be here? Being there is what we do, and yet doing that is exactly what makes us vulnerable to post-traumatic stress. In my experience, the extent of my injury, and I do label it an injury, correlates directly to how deep I went, how far I traveled into people's pain. That strikes me as a genuine occupational hazard. That which allows us to do our jobs is the very thing that creates burnout. It is the very thing that leads us to be overwhelmed or even self-destructive. I'll admit I have not always been good at self-care. I lived in Afghanistan and Pakistan for 4 years at the beginning of my career as a foreign correspondent, and my embeds with American troops beginning in 2008 were my first exposure to combat, to the threat of injury or death. That is the definition of trauma in this case. I responded by drinking a lot, by partying, by burning the proverbial candle at both ends. And I saw many correspondents do the same. I met amazing people who spun amazing stories, but also told stories of broken marriages, of children who lived far apart, families broken by addictions to adrenaline, the adrenaline combat reporting. I look back and I don't think I ever lost control, but I do acknowledge that I did not confront, did not particularly understand my feelings. I only coped with them as best I could. Over the years, I've tried to cope in different ways, and I understand now that the coping mechanisms are largely divided up into three. One, the self-care that you read about in books, exercise, yoga, Pilates, whatever it is that moves your body, allows you to literally sweat out some of the stress. There are other personal self-care steps, including anything you consider meditative. An old friend of mine at ABC News, Dan Harris, who left ABC after he wrote a book about meditation, points out that meditation is simply the act of being present 100%. He describes you can meditate in the act of opening a doorknob if you are simply able to focus your mind entirely on that moment. Meditation resets the brain. It's good. All resets, all breaks are important, whether they're coffee breaks or breaks from telling the stories, step away from the place you work, the place where you discuss trauma or you experience trauma, step away from combat reporting, step away from the front lines, at least for a while. That's all the self-care mechanisms. There's structural coping, of course, as well. Therapy, collaboration. I highly encourage sitting with therapists and sitting with colleagues. There is no replacement for those moments at the end of the day when, usually over a bourbon or something similar, you go over the day and you commiserate, and then you wake up again a few hours later and you start anew. But those personal and structural coping mechanisms, I've come to believe, have not been enough. I believe there's a third form of coping that is the most important, and that is the belief in the importance of our craft, the catharsis of storytelling. And to make this last point, one last story. In 2014, I was live on TV in Gaza, the last time that Israel conducted a ground invasion into Gaza. and the sound of explosions of Israeli airstrikes overwhelmed my voice. I knew they were so loud, viewers could not hear me. And so I said I would wait until the explosions stopped to continue. I stared into the camera, I don't even know, for a few seconds, probably. An eternity in TV time. I remember trying to keep my face neutral, but the anchor's face went white. He apologized to our viewers for, quote, keeping me out there and said I would get to a safe place, as if there is a safe place in war. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed, and it was a text message from my mother. Unfortunately, she had been watching, and she wrote this. She wrote, "You can't go before I do." It took me years to admit I'd been naive in assuming I could become a foreign correspondent, a war correspondent, and not emotionally harm myself or my family. Gaza, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, the locations are like merit badges on a reporter's sash. They're also scars, each one, that take a long time to heal, for me and many people around me. During periods of doubt, I have wondered whether my reporting was worth the risks, was worth the costs. I've lost relationships, become disconnected from people I loved, and burdened my nearest and dearest with the anxiety created solely by the choice I have made in what I do for a living. And of course, I've wondered sometimes whether I was motivated by the thrill rather than the substance of the story. But I have come to believe that the same empathy that made me vulnerable has helped steel me. I've come to believe that that empathy has provided me purpose. The act of writing Svetlana's story allows me to process the trauma I've been exposed to. The act of sharing Svetlana's story provides the reason for my taking risks, for putting my family through the pain of watching me stay silent as the missiles flew. And so too, sharing her story transforms the tale of an individual family into a story that can recapture stolen dignity, in which we can humanize that which has been dehumanized. Tell me about your son. Thank you very much.